Hi, automotive enthusiasts. Welcome to Boost Bureau, where passion meets precision and stories of legendary machines come roaring back to life. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most ferocious icons ever to roll out of Detroit, an American muscle car that didn't just challenge the status quo, it shredded it on sight, the 1967 Mustang Shelby GT500. This isn't just another classic car profile. It's a full-throttle journey into the soul of a machine that captured the rebellious spirit of a nation and turned it into steel, rubber, and thunder. The GT500 wasn't born in a boardroom or a focus group. It was forged in the crucible of competition, crafted by a man who believed cars should do more than move. They should make statements. Carroll Shelby, a Texan racer turned performance mastermind, took the already beloved Ford Mustang and injected it with a dose of raw, unapologetic power that would redefine what muscle cars could be. But the story of this beast isn't just about horsepower figures or quarter-mile times. It's about why America needed a car like this in the first place, why a generation hungry for speed and self-expression found its mechanical spirit animal in a long-hooded, big-block monster. It's about how the GT500 pushed engineering limits in ways that felt reckless yet brilliant, how it blurred the line between track weapon and street cruiser, and how it still casts a shadow over modern performance cars more than half a century later. Over the next hour, we're going to peel back the layers of this legend. We'll explore how the cultural storm of the 1960s set the stage for the GT500's explosive debut, how Shelby's engineering alchemy transformed a popular pony car into a muscle-bound predator, and how that legacy continues to roar today, not just in collector garages and auction houses, but in the DNA of every high-performance Mustang that follows. By the time we're done, you won't just know what made the GT500 so special. You'll feel why it mattered, and why its story still grips gearheads around the world. Buckle up, because this isn't just automotive history, it's the tale of a machine that became a movement. And like the GT500 itself, we're not slowing down for anyone. The Mustang Shelby GT500 emerged at a time when America was rethinking its identity, and the car became more than steel and horsepower. It became a mirror of ambition, rebellion, and sheer willpower. The foundation was the original Mustang, a pony car phenomenon launched in 1964, but by 1967 the market demanded something fiercer. Ford turned to Carroll Shelby, whose racing pedigree and unshakable drive made him the perfect partner for unleashing a machine unlike anything else on the street. The 1967 Shelby GT500 debuted with a 428 cubic inch police interceptor engine under its hood, capable of producing well over 350 horsepower, though enthusiasts whispered that the actual numbers felt far higher. Shelby's team wrapped this power in aggressive styling, dual scoops, stripes, and a long predatory stance that announced its presence before the key even turned. Buyers weren't just getting a car. They were buying entry into a myth, one rooted in performance credibility and outlaw charisma. Micro-story. Imagine a teenager in 1967 standing outside a dealership, gazing at a GT500 displayed in Wimbledon white with blue stripes. For him, this wasn't just a car, it was a dream wrapped in fiberglass and chrome. He couldn't afford it, not even close. But the poster of the Shelby on his bedroom wall kept him believing that one day he'd touch the untouchable. Stories like his multiplied across America, making the GT500 an aspirational icon that transcended mere ownership. Micro-story. Carroll Shelby's vision wasn't born from corporate spreadsheets, but from trackside grit. He knew what it meant to wrestle machines at Le Mans, to push engines until bolts rattled loose, to live with speed as both an ally and enemy. When he signed off on the GT500, it wasn't about creating a commuter-friendly vehicle. It was about bottling that race-born intensity into something everyday drivers could experience, if only they were daring enough. That decision made the GT500 a legend before its tires even hit the pavement. Context digest. The late 1960s were a breeding ground for muscle cars. Chevrolet had its Camaro, Pontiac had the GTO, Dodge had the Charger. Each was vying for the same audience. Young, thrill-seeking drivers who wanted cars that looked aggressive and sounded even meaner. The Shelby GT500 entered this arena not just to compete, but to dominate, carrying the Shelby name as a badge of credibility that no other rival could match. Micro-story. On suburban streets, the GT500 wasn't just seen, it was felt. Neighbors would pause conversations when one rumbled by, its exhaust note rolling like thunder. Parents shook their heads at its audacity, while teenagers plotted impossible schemes to get behind the wheel. Even parked, it radiated menace. Long hood, scoops gulping air, tail end flaring with Shelby badging. It was less a car and more a declaration: speed lives here. Reflection bridge. Yet the GT500 was more than a marketing triumph. It embodied tensions between safety, regulation, and freedom that defined the era. Context digest. Government agencies were beginning to notice the horsepower wars. Insurance companies hiked premiums, safety advocates warned of reckless power, and lawmakers considered tighter controls. For Shelby, these pressures were background noise. He understood that his cars were dangerous, but he also believed that driving was about choice, about trusting individuals to handle power responsibly. This conflict gave the GT500 an edge. It wasn't just about speed, it was about the right to have it. Micro story. An owner in California recalls taking delivery of his GT500 in the summer of 1967. He drove it straight from the dealership to the Pacific Coast Highway. Top down, exhaust echoing against cliffs. Tourists stopped to take pictures, not because they knew its stats, but because the car radiated charisma. To him, it wasn't about drag racing or proving numbers. It was about feeling part of something larger than himself, a cultural wave carried on four wheels. Context digest. Culturally, America was shifting. Rock music blared louder, youth movements demanded freedom, and traditional authority was being challenged at every turn. The GT500 fit perfectly into that landscape, offering not just a means of transport, but a symbol of defiance. Owning one wasn't simply about driving. It was about declaring independence from the mundane, staking a claim to individuality at a time when conformity felt suffocating. Micro story. At local car meets, GT500s drew crowds like magnets. Hood open, enthusiasts would marvel at the massive engine bay, pointing out details like the dual 4-barrel carburetors and Shelby-specific touches. Kids pressed their faces against chrome bumpers, wide-eyed at the scale of it all. Owners became instant celebrities, their cars transforming parking lots into arenas of envy and admiration. The GT500 wasn't just a possession, it was a ticket into an elite club where metal and myth intertwined. Reflection bridge. What began as an answer to market demand quickly spiraled into a phenomenon that carried weight far beyond the showroom floor. And as the story evolved, the GT500 became a lightning rod for debates about power, responsibility, and the future of American performance. All of this momentum built toward a deeper reality. The GT500 wasn't just Shelby's creation. It was a cultural flashpoint, and the stakes were only going to get higher as its legend grew, and the landscape around it changed. This is where the next chapter of its journey takes us. As the Shelby GT500's roar echoed across America, it entered a new phase where performance collided with perception, and the myth began to outgrow the machine itself. By 1968 and beyond, the GT500 evolved with subtle refinements, styling tweaks, optional features, even a shift to the even rarer GT500 KR, nicknamed the King of the Road. This wasn't just a car anymore. It was a cultural phenomenon that commanded attention in magazines, television, and eventually the silver screen. With each passing year, its aura deepened, and so did the debates around what it represented. Was it a triumph of engineering, a dangerous indulgence, or something larger, an artifact of America's restless soul? Micro story. In 1974, a young driver stumbled upon a used GT500 on a dusty lot. Gasoline prices had skyrocketed due to the oil crisis, and suddenly, thirsty muscle cars seemed like relics of another world. He bought it for far less than its original sticker price, not realizing that decades later, that same machine would be worth hundreds of thousands at auction. For him, it was simply a gamble, a chance to own a slice of history when the rest of the country was moving toward economy cars. That personal leap echoed a larger theme. The GT500 survived even when the market shifted against it. Context digest. The oil crisis and tightening emission standards of the 1970s gutted the muscle car market. Engines shrank, horsepower figures plummeted, and once mighty names became shadows of their former selves. Yet the 1967 GT500 and its immediate successors resisted that erasure because they were already embedded in memory, frozen as symbols of a golden age. While the industry bent to regulations, the GT500 lingered in garages, posters, and daydreams, reminding enthusiasts of what once was possible. Micro story. During the late 1970s, a group of college students restored a battered GT500 in a backyard garage. They scraped together parts from junkyards, welded panels in borrowed space, and poured every ounce of spare time into resurrecting it. The car wasn't perfect, paint mismatched, interior patched. But when they fired the engine and heard that unmistakable rumble, they felt connected to a legacy bigger than themselves. That shared labor made the GT500 more than a car. It became a generational handshake across time. Reflection bridge. Nostalgia became fuel, and nostalgia has a way of turning scarcity into value. Context digest. By the 1980s and 1990s, collector culture began to recognize the GT500's importance. Auction houses recorded steadily climbing bids, while restoration shops specialized in bringing these icons back to life. Movies and television amplified the mystique, particularly when a modified GT500, known as Eleanor, starred in a Hollywood heist story, introducing the car to a whole new audience who may never have read a spec sheet, but knew magic when they saw it. The GT500 was reborn in pop culture, cementing its myth beyond enthusiasts alone. Micro story. An auction in Scottsdale, Arizona saw an original GT500 cross the block under bright lights. Bidders with deep pockets battled fiercely, the hammer eventually dropping at a figure unimaginable when the car was new. The audience erupted in applause, not because of the money, but because they were witnessing proof that legends don't depreciate, they ascend. That moment captured how a machine built for speed had transformed into rolling art, its value as much about storytelling as engineering. Context digest. Meanwhile, Ford and Shelby's partnership found new life. After years apart, they reunited in the 2000s to revive the GT500 nameplate, channeling the DNA of 1967 into modern iterations equipped with superchargers, advanced suspensions, and creature comforts Carroll Shelby could never have imagined. Each new version carried the torch, proving that the 1967 original wasn't a fossil but a foundation. Buyers lined up, not just for performance but for a direct link to history. Micro story. A father handed his son the keys to a newly purchased modern GT500, but before they drove, he pulled out an old Polaroid of himself beside his first car, a 1967 GT500 parked outside his childhood home. The connection between generations wasn't theoretical. It was tangible, captured in horsepower and memory. That duality, past and present fused, made the Shelby name more powerful than any dyno chart. Reflection bridge. What began as a singular experiment in 1967 now carried the weight of heritage, economics, and global fascination. Micro story. In Europe, where small, nimble cars dominated, the GT500 appeared in shows and exhibitions like a visiting gladiator. Crowds marveled at its sheer size, its thunderous note, its unapologetic presence. To them, it represented American excess and ambition, yet admiration was undeniable. It wasn't practical, it wasn't efficient, but it was unforgettable, and that made it desirable. The GT500 had crossed oceans not by numbers, but by myth. The myth, however, had consequences. By the 21st century, the GT500 wasn't only a story of freedom and rebellion, it was also a mirror reflecting changing ideas about speed, safety, and the environment. As its legend grew, so too did the question. How does a machine built for unrestrained power survive in a world increasingly defined by restraint? The answer would take the GT500 into its most profound chapter yet, where legacy confronted the realities of the modern age. The modern era forced the Shelby GT500 to prove its relevance in a world no longer defined by cheap gas, open roads, and limitless horsepower. The 1967 original had set a standard of excess that seemed impossible to replicate in the 21st century, but instead of fading into nostalgic obscurity, the GT500 adapted and evolved. Each revival was a statement. America would not give up its muscle icon. Even as regulations tightened, roads grew more crowded, and technology reshaped the very concept of performance. The question shifted from whether the GT500 could survive to how it could continue to matter. Micro story. A young engineer at Ford in the mid-2000s recalled studying the 1967 GT500's proportions late at night, tracing the body lines on drafting software. For him, the challenge was clear: create a car that honored Shelby's raw legacy without feeling like a museum piece. When the revived GT500 launched in 2007, it wasn't just a marketing decision. It was a generational promise that the beast would never be tamed. Owners immediately felt that they weren't buying nostalgia, but carrying forward a flame. Context Digest. By the 2010s, the automotive landscape was dominated by global platforms, efficiency targets, and electronic aids. Against that backdrop, the GT500 returned with supercharged V8s producing horsepower figures Carroll Shelby could only dream about. Stability control, advanced braking, and digital tuners made it accessible to a new audience while preserving the brutal thrust that defined its origin. It was proof that heritage could coexist with modernity, and in doing so, the GT500 secured its place not as a relic, but as a benchmark. Microstory. At a track day, a driver lined up his brand new GT500 next to a preserved 1967 original. Spectators crowded the pit wall, watching as old and new thundered down the straight. The older car carried history, its roar primal and raw, while the modern one delivered surgical speed. Together, they told a story that numbers alone could not convey. Muscle wasn't about decades, it was about attitude. That duel symbolized the continuity of spirit across generations. Reflection Bridge. The GT500 had become not just a car, but a conversation between past and present. Context Digest. Pop culture continued to amplify the Shelby mystique. Video games featured digital versions of the GT500, allowing teenagers across the globe to virtually drive what their parents only dreamed about. Movies placed it in center frame as shorthand for rebellion and cool. Music videos, commercials, and social media all borrowed its silhouette and sound, proof that the car had become visual shorthand for American muscle itself. Even those who had never turned a wrench or shifted a manual recognized the GT500 as a symbol of power. Microstory. In Japan, a car collector stored a pristine 1967 GT500 beside modern supercars. Visitors often gravitated toward the Shelby, marveling not at its refinement but at its sheer presence. For a culture that revered precision, the GT500's brashness was exotic and irresistible. It spoke of roads far away, of highways without limits, of a time when rules bent to ambition. That global reach turned the Shelby from an American idol into a worldwide legend. Microstory. A young woman in Detroit restored her grandfather's 1967 GT500 after finding it under a tarp in his garage. With each bolt tightened and panel polished, she uncovered family stories hidden in grease and rust. When the engine roared to life, neighbors came to hear it, many sharing memories of their own encounters with Shelbys decades before. For her, the car was more than horsepower. It was heritage, a bridge across time that connected her to a man she had lost. The GT500 became living memory. Context Digest. Collectors, investors, and enthusiasts all shaped the GT500's modern identity. Auction houses reported record-breaking sales for original 1967 models, sometimes exceeding $1 million. Museums showcased them as cultural artifacts, while aftermarket tuners continued pushing performance envelopes. This combination of rarity, mythology, and adaptability cemented the GT500 as more than a car. It was an asset, a story, a status symbol that refused to depreciate in meaning. Microstory. At a charity gala, a GT500 was raffled off, drawing donations from people who didn't even drive. The winner wept as the keys were handed over, not because of the financial value, but because the Shelby symbolized a lifelong dream. That reaction summed up the car's power, its ability to stir emotions far deeper than torque or top speed. Reflection Bridge. What began in 1967 as a rebellious answer to a horsepower war had, over decades, transformed into a cultural monument. The GT500 now exists in two worlds at once, as a tangible machine that can still annihilate racetracks, and as an untouchable legend that transcends steel and gasoline. Its story is one of survival, adaptation, and resonance. In the end, the untamed muscle icon proved that power is never just about engines, it's about meaning. And that meaning still drives forward, carrying the Shelby name into a future where heritage matters just as much as horsepower. So as we close this journey through the story of the 1967 Mustang Shelby GT500, it's worth stepping back and asking what makes a machine endure long after its production ends. At its heart, the GT500 was never just about specifications, though they were staggering for the time. It was about timing, personality, and symbolism. Carroll Shelby understood that cars could embody spirit as much as steel, and the GT500 was his loudest proclamation of that idea. Born in the turbulence of the late 1960s, the GT500 became an instant icon because it spoke to an audience that craved freedom, individuality, and defiance. That combination turned it into more than a muscle car. It became a cultural artifact that continues to resonate. Over the decades, it weathered crises, vanished from production, resurfaced in new forms, and grew in value and stature. It became immortalized on screen, in collectors' garages, and in the imagination of people who never had the chance to drive one. Each revival has kept its pulse alive, each restoration has rekindled its flame, and each modern iteration has paid homage to the thunder that started in 1967. The Shelby GT500 is proof that legends do not fade with time. They adapt, they evolve, and they inspire. For automotive enthusiasts, the lesson is clear. A car is never just a car when it connects to the spirit of its era and the aspirations of the people who encounter it. The GT500 captured a moment in history but also transcended it, carrying forward ideals of performance and independence into every generation that followed. That is why even today, decades later, the mere sight or sound of one still stirs something primal. Thanks for riding with us on Boost Bureau. See you next time, automotive enthusiasts.